Tony Hawk's Pro Skater is one of those rare franchises that transcended its medium. It quickly became a cultural touchstone for 90s kids to the extent that it defined the way extreme sports games were to be designed for the next few years. It also displayed what made that decade extraordinary: the weird stylings of Gen X fashion, self-expression, and underground music. Tony Hawk's Pro Skater was lightning in a bottle, and that storm raged on for many years. It instantly became an annualized franchise, putting it beside other icons like Crash Bandicoot and Spyro. And Neversoft, original developer of the series, would see this success last 10 games spread across 8 years and 3 console generations, from Pro Skater all the way up to Proving Ground. The Birdman was seemingly unstoppable. And while interest eventually started to die out after American Wasteland, the 7th game in the series, scores remained fairly high, and sales never dipped so low as to become a financial failure. For better or worse, no other extreme sports game has been able to recapture that success. And that's because the very first Pro Skater hit the right notes at the right time. Before we continue, I think it's important to talk about the rise of skateboarding into the mainstream. Before THPS exploded onto the scene, skating was relegated mainly to social outcasts, fully immersed in street culture like punk rock and hip hop. The early accessibility of media related to the sport generally existed with low budget tapes passed around between friends or bought from your local skate shop. It was very much an underground movement that thrived on the DIY work ethic associated with other subcultures like the aforementioned punk and hip hop. It was loud, abrasive, and not made for the mainstream. What made extreme sports, and in particular skating, so special was the means of self-expression. Unlike conventional sports, there are no rules. If you can dream it, you can do it. This led to all kinds of different styles of skating, from street to vert to whatever the hell Rodney Mullen was doing at the time. These kinds of self-expressionist ideas fit in well with that weird decade known as the 90s, filled with flannel, chain wallets, and fitted caps. It was a 10-year love affair with all things counterculture. Bands like Smashing Pumpkins, Sonic Youth, and Nirvana were hitting it big. To be fair, those bands all started and had decent careers during the mid to late 80s, but all had mainstream success after Smells Like Teen Spirit broke the charts in 1991. Skating and alternative music go hand in hand like cheese and Vegemite. It just works. No matter the era of underground music that's concurrent with underground counterculture, skating is somehow always attached at the hip, and nothing accentuated this more than those DIY skate tapes. Skaters did small sessions, usually about 2 to 3 minutes long, accompanied by music, and these songs became a staple of skate tapes in the 80s, carrying on long into the modern day. The perfect example of all this hitting the mainstream for the first time is Sonic Youth's 1992 music video for 100%. It features a pre-My Name is Earl Jason Lee, and was the first non-skate video directed by Spike Jonze. It's a melting pot of 90s grunge and skate culture, in not only sound but every part of the overall aesthetic. It's an amazing time capsule I highly recommend people go back and watch. A few years later, in 1995, extreme sports really started to take off with the X Games. The X Games were a cultural powerhouse developed by ESPN as a means to grab attention from Generation X crowds, drawing in big names from all kinds of extreme sports, such as Travis Pastrana, Matt Hoffman, Dave Mirra, and Tony Hawk. So what does all of this have to do with video games? Well, after the explosion of the X Games, an entirely new market was suddenly open and ripe for the taking: extreme sports video games. This isn't to say developers didn't give these kinds of games their own fair shake previously. Atari released 720 in arcades in 1986, California Games in 1987, and there was the short-lived Skate or Die series in 1988 to 1990. But the market wasn't ready for this at the time. Gaming was still seen as the basement dweller nerd hobby, and skating was for the other kind of outcast. The crossover was still a decade away. However, these games did lay a foundation for what was to come. The public consciousness of skateboarding changed on June 27, 1999 at the 4th annual X Games, when Tony Hawk did what was thought to be impossible. He landed the 900, a 2.5 rotation on a skateboard out of a halfpipe. This skyrocketed the Birdman from underground legend to household name seemingly overnight. A couple of months later, on the 31st of August, Tony Hawk's Pro Skater was released to massive critical and commercial success. In a year of Silent Hill, System Shock 2, and Donkey Kong 64, I don't think anyone expected a game about skateboarding to be one of the highest selling titles that year. Backtracking a little bit, after seeing this rise in popularity of the sport, Activision sought out Neversoft to task them with making their very own skateboarding game. Initially starting out as a racing game, focus shifted to a more open, arcade style once Activision saw what the engine was capable of during work on Neversoft's other game, Apocalypse. Once all the groundwork was laid out for what the game was going to be, a name to sell the game still needed to be attached. So the team approached Tony Hawk fairly late into development. As soon as he signed on, he didn't just put his name and face to a product. If he was going to be involved, it needed to be with something he felt would reflect the skate scene. Hawk had builds sent to him to be critiqued, and he even handpicked some of the game's soundtrack. With his involvement, Pro Skater became about as authentic in tone as you could possibly get to the subculture. While Tony Hawk was one of the most prolific names in skateboarding at the time, his success with landing the 900 is the reason for this new game garnering instant brand recognition, helping the initial wave of success the game found. But a name alone doesn't help a game maintain lasting power. It's what's inside that keeps it around. While there are many reasons to fondly remember what made the first and subsequent titles memorable, it's undeniable that it was the soundtrack that carries the most nostalgia for people. That drum-fill intro for Goldfinger's Superman is so vividly etched into my memory that I can't hear it without remembering all the times I hit the restart button on a session, hoping it would be the song to accompany my playtime. Prior to THPS's release, game soundtracks were either original scores or chip-tuned renditions of popular songs, like those seen in Blizzard's early title Rock 'n' Roll Racing. The use of relatively unknown bands worked on two levels. Firstly, it was a fantastic way to use a limited budget. And secondly, because of how open 90s culture had become to weird and experimental music, audiences were more receptive to hearing songs like Jerry Was a Race Car Driver in their games. The 2-minute time limit also helped each session of finding the skate letters, hidden VHS tapes, and attempted a new high score feel like its own segment in a skate video. It drew from everything about what made the prior decade of counterculture and skateboarding feel right. Tony Hawk's Pro Skater was such a powerhouse that even looking at the box art is strange to do now, because skaters like Bob Burnquist, Chad Musker, Kareem Campbell, and Alyssa Steamer were not big names. But as Pro Skater grew in popularity, these names became commonplace. As new games entered the Pro Skater series and introduced more complicated mechanics, new skaters, and even level editors to really drive home that freeform feeling of self-expression through skating, so too did the soundtracks get more diverse. With some money behind them now, Neversoft was able to use Rage Against the Machine's 1991 song Killing in the Name Of, which was a good bridge between the new emerging use of hip-hop in the games and their initial use of just punk and metal. Now we had Naughty by Nature sitting next to Lagwagon in 2, Exhibit teamed up with AFI in 3, and they even used AC/DC's TNT as the title track for the fourth and last Neversoft Pro Skater title. It's an eclectic mix of tastes to reflect all the diverse backgrounds of the subcultures that loved skating, a celebration of everyone. Did THPS change and influence how the charts saw music, and by extension how the mainstream saw Gen X subcultures? Not really. The closest thing I could find is the explosion in popularity of Blink-182 after they released Enema of the State, and it launched up the charts shortly after the initial Tony Hawk game released in 1999. But since What's My Age Again was already doing big numbers as a pre-release single in April of that year, it's more of a coincidence, and if anything, helped Pro Skater's soundtrack be more palatable to a general audience of people ready to delve into these things themselves. What did happen was the opening of the underground to an entire generation. Even though Gen X was already aware of the weird and wonderful side of alternative cultures, the mainstream wasn't exactly reflective of that. Sure, you had Nirvana absolutely destroying records in the early 90s, but they were more an exception than the rule, despite the heavy influence of grunge on street fashion. The 90s was still, at its core, the decade of boy bands, girl groups, and Ricky Martin above all else when it came to top big pop icons. Southern California punk rock legends Bad Religion have gone on record to say the use of their song You in Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 2 is the reason they got famous. Hell, even Motorhead saw a resurgence of younger fans again because of Ace of Spades' inclusion. The result of these crazy and abrasive soundtracks was young kids finding songs that fit their angsty ideals, which then later on manifested into forming their own bands. The undisputed kings of the mid-2000s emo revival, My Chemical Romance, say they would not have been a band if not for Tony Hawk's Pro Skater. The influence on pop culture wasn't immediate as the game's success, but the foundations were there and the floodgates opened. Personally for me, having an older brother who was already involved in 90s punk meant I found bands I already enjoyed. AFI, Bad Religion, Suicidal Tendencies. But they were just old tapes handed down to me. When I heard them in a video game of all things, when all I knew previously was game music, something I usually muted in favor of playing those aforementioned tapes, it ignited a spark inside of me. Suddenly, playing in a band seemed like an attainable goal, so that's what I set out to do. A few years later, when I was actually old enough to do so, I sought out local bands who sounded like those ones I heard in Tony Hawk's games, saw them live, picked up a bass and a guitar, and played music for years. I played shows around the country. I worked as a touring manager, and it became my life. I know I can't speak for everyone, but I think it's a fair assumption to say that most people who were old enough to appreciate any of the Tony Hawk's games from 1 through to Proving Grounds were inspired directly or indirectly by just how different the sound of it all was. Tony Hawk's biggest legacy was arguably its music and how it impacted what a game soundtrack could be. But its influence didn't stop there. Like all trends in media, people tried to recapture that bottle of lightning for themselves. Neversoft's parent company, Activision, created its own subdivision called Activision O2 in 2001 in order to really squeeze out as much as possible from extreme sports games, bringing in developers from multiple small-time studios to develop Sean Palmer's Pro Snowboarder, Matt Hoffman's Pro BMX, and Kelly Slater's Pro Surfer. But they didn't have that Neversoft touch, and none of those names ever landed the 900. Once something is popular, everyone wants a piece of the action. The X Games released their own spin-off of the Hawk formula. Even Disney and The Simpsons tried to get on board, but nothing else ever stuck. That is, until Danny Way teamed up with EA in 2007 to release Skate, the same year as Neversoft's last Tony Hawk game Proving Ground. Skate stripped back the bombastic arcade-like nature and replaced it with a more down-to-earth, simplified control scheme, making even the simplest trick an accomplishment. But it did something The Simpsons and Mickey Mouse didn't, brought back a good soundtrack. Skate perfectly replicated the mix of punk, metal, and hip-hop like the games of old. Bands like Black Flag, NWA, Slayer, and Band of Horses all on one list. As a game, Skate is fantastic in its own right, and its sequels are even better, but it was a nostalgia trip back to that first Pro Skater release in 1999, and that helped people connect with it. It was a reminder of all those weird things Tony Hawk introduced the world to. I remember the two selling points about it when my friends first told me to play it were, it's like real skating, and the songs on it remind me of Tony Hawk's Pro Skater. THBS was a bookend to the 90s, and captured everything that made the previous decade special. Gameplay that promoted self-expression, a soundtrack stacked with grunge, punk rock, and crossover thrash, a cast of some of the biggest legends of the skate scene, and the embracing of everything strange. Video games have always had a profound impact on me and many others. They can leave us questioning a lot of things, bring out emotions we didn't expect, but I don't think we will ever get another franchise like Tony Hawk's. One that shaped the way a lot of people look for music, sought out involvement in different subcultures, and embraced who they wanted to be.